Let's face it, in our busy lives, we don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. In fact, according to the CDC, only 1 in 10 Americans are eating the recommended daily amount of fruits and vegetables each day, missing out on essential vitamins, minerals, fibers, and antioxidants. And that's where Balance in Nature comes in. Balance in Nature sources only the best produce, free from pesticides, heavy metals, and harmful bacteria. And Balance in Nature is the best fruit and vegetable product on the market. They use only fresh, whole fruits and vegetables inside each capsule. They don't use any GMOs, fillers, binding agents, or preservatives of any kind. You're getting real food, real science, real nutrition. I would never endorse a product that I don't use myself, and since using Balance in Nature, I feel more alert, I have more energy, my focus is sharper, and I feel great. Live life to the fullest and choose Balance in Nature. And guess what? P.A.S. Report listeners can get 35% off the first preferred order. Start getting the recommended daily amount of fruits and vegetables you need by using code PAS at balanceofnature.com.
Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano, and I hope you enjoyed your weekend. I'm really looking forward to this episode because I have a great guest coming on, someone who I have long admired and respected, one of the few people in politics that I could say without a doubt is one of the most decent human beings out there. You can't say that about too many people that have been in Washington, D.C., now can you? But I can about him. Before I introduce today's guest, I do want to bring up the president for a minute because I swear, sometimes the timing I have is amazing. Last Wednesday, I dropped an episode talking about how the Democrat political agenda has been utter failure and how the Democrats are playing the one card they know how to play very well, and that's the fear card. I discussed how they were very successful at instilling this irrational fear when it came to COVID. I provided people's own words on how they were vaxxed, boosted, wore N95, socially isolated themselves for nearly 2.5 years, and how they still got COVID. Now I have another example, and that's why the timing was truly amazing. I released the episode on Wednesday, recorded it on Tuesday, and then on Thursday, you have President Biden coming out and announcing that he now has coronavirus. He is double vaxxed, double boosted. I wish him well, because I for damn sure don't want to think about Vice President Kamala Harris taking over. But with that being said, last week's episode, I raised two important questions. First of all, why are we still calling this a vaccine when at best it treats symptoms and reduces complications, but it also has its own complications? But secondly, and more importantly, why are people still getting fired for being unvaccinated? And I think the second question is actually even more important today than it was when I dropped the episode, especially considering you now have Washington, D.C. issuing a mandate that all children have to get vaccinated to attend public or private school. This is insane. Why would we require a vaccine on children for a virus that is no threat to most children, especially given that the vaccine doesn't even do anything to stop the spread or transmission? A vaccine that we know has very consequential side effects, particularly for young people, and we still have no idea what the long-term impacts of the vaccine is. Now, they'll scream, that's disinformation, blah, 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 but I no longer trust these people. They have destroyed trust. They have destroyed the credibility of our institutions, and that's on them. Who the hell do these officials think they are? But I don't want to get too mad. I just figured I would point out the obvious. I want to get to today's guest, though, because it's someone that I've wanted to talk to for a very long time, and it is my pleasure to bring in the former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President Trump, the author of Created Equal, Dr. Ben Carson. Dr. Carson is an amazing man with an amazing story to tell. He's someone who overcame numerous obstacles in his life and exemplifies the greatness of America and why America is such an exceptional nation. Now, he started the American Cornerstone Institute shortly after leaving the Trump administration, and he focuses on the 4 cornerstones that laid the foundation for the greatest nation the world has ever seen: faith, liberty, community, and life. The promotion and preservation of these 4 cornerstones can secure the United States as the beacon of hope and freedom for generations to come. And I have all the links up at the PAS Report, so make sure that you hit the follow button so you never miss an episode of this podcast. Go to the PAS Report website, pasreport.com. Check out the show notes. Link up with Dr. Ben Carson and the American Cornerstone Institute. And with that out of the way, I want to bring in Dr. Ben Carson to the PAS Report, author of Created Equal. Dr. Carson, thank you so much for coming on the PAS Report. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm glad you could be here because there's so many things about your book that I find interesting. And as someone that's been in academics for nearly 2 decades, you talk about the idea of education as the great equalizer. Can you explain to the audience what you mean by the great equalizer?
Well, in a free society, such as the one that we have here in America, where your success is dependent upon you, obviously, the more you know, the more valuable you become, the more able you are to take advantage of some of the opportunities that exist. And, growing up in dire poverty and listening to people around me who were disgusted and who felt like they were victims, and then listening to people like my mother, on the other hand, who didn't have much in the way of education, but worked around people who had education and recognized what an enormous advantage they had, and insisted that my brother and I avail ourselves of those opportunities, and made us read books and give her written book reports, even though she couldn't read them. What an incredible difference it made for both of us. And her friends were always criticizing her and saying, "You can't make boys stay in the house and read books. They'll grow up and they'll hate you." And I would overhear them sometimes. And I'd say, "Mother, they're right." But it didn't matter. We still had to read those books. And, she had the last laugh because one son became a brain surgeon and the other became a rocket scientist.
Yeah, it really is a remarkable story. And looking at the education system today, I give my students a citizenship exam on the first day of the semester for every semester. I do this. I've been doing it for so long. And students today can hardly pass a citizenship exam. It seems that our education system has broken down. It doesn't really teach students anymore. It doesn't encourage curiosity or critical thinking. How do we begin to restore that? How do we begin to support that?
Well, it does teach them. It just teaches them the wrong stuff. That's the problem. And what is encouraging to me as I travel around the country, I was speaking to a mother's group yesterday, is we have so many people now who are getting involved. People who used to stand in the corner with their head down and hope no one called them a nasty name are running for the school board, are insisting on seeing the curriculum that their kids are being taught. And this is really the key, because even our enemies, people like Vladimir Lenin, a Marxist, said, "Give me your children to teach for 4 years, and the seed that I sow will never be uprooted." They recognize the importance of indoctrinating our kids. Well, we can take the same tack. We can make sure that we give them a solid foundation of the right kinds of things. And that's why at American Cornerstone, we have the Little Patriots program, an online K-5 teaching program, beautiful animations. We've hired some of the best people from Disney and Pixar and ABC Kids, who are non-woke people, by the way.
I was going to say.
To create these beautiful lessons. And they have quizzes associated with them. They can use the home schools, public schools, private schools, all kinds of settings. People are signing up in droves. There were 23,000 signups just last week. It's free of charge, by the way, because we get people to underwrite the program. And then we take the books, like we have a new book coming, just came out for kids, called Red, White, and Blue, Our Flag Matters to Me and You. And teaches children what our flag means and why do we have the freedoms that we have. And all the proceeds from that book go right back into the program so that we can continue to make it free.
One of the things that I found over the years is parents took a hands-off approach to education. In this day and age, parents are working, they're busy. There's a lot of distractions that exist out there. And so they said, the school exists to teach my children, so I don't have to do it. But what you're showing is that it's important that parents supplement whatever the school's teaching. And if the school is teaching something that's wrong, essentially it's the parent's job to correct it. And I think that's what this program does. Am I correct?
Absolutely. And also, we need to continue to push the school systems back to what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to teach the basics that you need to be successful in our society. They're not supposed to be teaching you what your value system are. That comes from your home. That comes from your parents.
With CRT, because we're seeing that when it comes to critical race theory or diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, they're trying to push this narrative that essentially the color of your skin defines who you are as a person. It defines the essence of a person.
Yes.
And unfortunately, it's like a poison. And you also talk about that in the book as well, that this is a poison that's being pushed on our children.
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about what these theories are teaching people, that our system is rotten to the core. It was built in such a way as to maintain superiority of one group over another group. How is that going to better the society that you live in? When you teach white kids that they're oppressors and that all of their relatives were oppressors, and you teach black kids and minorities that they're victims and that the system is stacked against you and it needs to fundamentally be changed, how in the world is that going to create a society where there's peace and satisfaction? It's not. And, they try to make it seem like because we had slavery in America, that we are permanently damaged and that we are an evil nation. Well, history will tell you, and as a teacher, virtually every society has had to deal with slavery since the beginning of time. And we actually have more slaves in the world today than we've ever had in history when you look at human trafficking. And who is the principal consumer of that trafficking? The United States of America. So we got real problems going on right now, today, with human rights. We don't have to dig up something from 200 years ago. But the fact of the matter is, there is something that's unique about the United States and slavery. And that is that we were the only country where we had so many people who were outraged and vehemently opposed slavery that we were willing to fight a bloody civil war and lose a large portion of our population to get rid of the evil institution. That's what our kids need now.
Absolutely. And when you examine it, I mean, I look at the United States, I've studied the foundings of the education system, and the United States is a unique country because it's the only country in the world with all these different peoples from different places that could come together and coexist peacefully together. And the education system was designed to create a sense of nationhood amongst people, that this is a new nation. So there's got to be something that links them together. And yet today we see people that want to just undo all that. They want to throw it away. They look at this idea of America and they have this slanted view that America is an inherently racist place. And we were founded solely on the basis of slavery when that's simply not true. Do you find it unique that if we go back to the segregation era, where the idea of separate but equal, obviously it wasn't really equal. However, you had Black people that were being harshly discriminated against, brutalized, and yet they still taught the students, the Black teachers taught Black students to appreciate America, to love America, that one day we're going to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. And, when you look at people from any part of the world, whether they're from Europe, Asia, Africa, it doesn't matter. And they came here, their ancestors came here, and they are better off than they would have been where they were before. That's the promise of America. That's why it is the destination for so many people from around the world. And people try to say that it's a systemically racist country and that if you belong to certain groups, you shouldn't come here. But if that were true, why would people be forming caravans trying to get in here? And when they got here, wouldn't they call all their relatives and friends and say, don't come here, this is a horrible place? That's not what's happening. Just the opposite is happening. So, we need to obviously appreciate the place that we live. We need to try to preserve it for those who are coming behind us. And we need to recognize that those who want to fundamentally change us have to first convince us that it's a horrible place and that it needs to be changed, and that they're trying to manipulate us into believing that so that they can get us to go along with their agendas. I believe the American people are too smart for that.
And do you think the American people are fed up of what's being pushed on the children in this day and age, from the schools to Hollywood to the corporate wokeism that exists out there? I mean, we're seeing this all-out assault. And parenting, you grew up in a difficult childhood. Mm-hmm. Parenting was always a difficult job. It's the hardest job I ever had. But now it seems like it's even more difficult than ever before, given all the information that's out there.
Yeah, well, you have so many forces coming after a child. Can you imagine what it would be like to be a little child growing up in America today? In some places, you still have to wear masks. You can't see people's facial expressions, which is an important part of sociological development. And you're told that you may be harboring some horrible disease It may not affect you, but you could give it to your grandmother and kill her. Well, grandmothers get older and they die. Now you're feeling guilty about that. And then you're told if you're white, you're an oppressor, and you and all your ancestors are evil people. If you're black, you're a victim. All of this while you're trying to form your self-image. And then if that's not bad enough, you may not be a girl or a boy. I mean, can you imagine growing up in those kinds of circumstances? It's child abuse, and we have to fight for the children.
It is. And I look at everything that's been done over the last 2 years. You just brought up mass. I thought that was criminal, what was taking place. I mean, as someone that was a surgeon, you did surgeries. You wore a surgical mask during those surgeries. And yet I constantly hear the argument, well, it works for surgeons, so it's going to work for everyone else. I also have background in emergency management and wrote pandemic plans. And we talked about universal masking, saying it's never going to work. People aren't going to wear them right. There's certain types of masks that would only be effective. Surgical masks, cloth masks are not going to be effective. Can you just explain that masking children for that long period of time, 6 to 8 hours a day for almost 2 years, how that affects a child?
Well, first of all, it breaks the connections that people have. So their sociological development is adversely impacted. And, there have been a number of studies recently that have shown that these kids have regressed in terms of their learning and in terms of their sociological development. And I think that coupled with the resentment that we're teaching people and some of the games that they're exposed to, I think that's really the reason that we're having these young people involved in these mass shootings. We try to say that it's the guns. It's not the guns, it's the people behind the guns and the kinds of attitudes that we're developing in them. I'm surprised that it isn't worse than it is, to be quite honest with you. And we need to be starting to think about the implications of what we're doing to people.
Yeah, and I think that many miss the most profound question of all. And why is it that a generation coming up has such little regard for human life? And nobody asks that question. I think that's probably the most profound question, because if you pass a gun law, well, then the next mass shooting, they're going to try and take more gun laws. Well, why are they doing it in the first place? Why not get to the root cause of the problem? And you're someone, you've been in government. Isn't that one of the biggest problems of government? They never look to get to the root causes of problems.
Yeah, well, because they're looking at things from an ideological standpoint. They're not really trying to solve the problem. They're trying to bolster their position. And there are very few in the political arena who actually have their head screwed on the right way. And a lot of them start out that way, but it seems like when they get to the position of power, some kind of disease begins to, there are some who maintain, but not very many. And it's very disturbing. I was really quite shocked when I came to Washington with all these ideals of how we're going to make people independent. And the resistance was just unbelievable on the Hill. They don't want people to be independent. They want them to be dependent.
It's interesting that you say that, because you're someone, I mean, obviously you worked in the medical bureaucracy for decades prior to going to Washington, D.C. When you got to Washington, D.C., and you're the secretary of HUD, what was the biggest thing that shocked you within the organization? Not the politicians on Capitol Hill, the legislators in the House and the Senate, but just in the bureaucratic agency itself. What was something that really surprised you?
The fact that they had not had an audit in 8 years. They're supposed to have an audit every year, but the financial situation was so screwed up that it was impossible. There were so many material defects, you couldn't actually do an audit. So one of the first things I had to do was convince a very talented auditor from Ernst & Young to come and join us. So it took a lot of arm twisting.
But, I can imagine.
But he did, and put together a team, and they were able to straighten it out. I would say HUD financially is the best run government agency now. I hope it stays that way. Well, but that's possible to do a lot of other things.
One of the things that got very little attention under your leadership is you looked at the conditions of some of the housing that people were living in, the government-assisted housing, and you found them repulsive, and you called for immediate reforms to improve the quality of those people's lives. Why do you think the media ignored that? Like, to me, that was such a big deal.
Well, there were a lot of things that they ignored. We got a lot of great things done because of the administration and the media bias. If we had done something bad, believe me, you'd hear about that.
No, of course.
Not a problem, because, it's really, I don't particularly care about a lot of attention. I just believe that if God gives you talent to do something, you need to do it and not worry about credit.
And do you look at media and big tech as contributing to the problems that we're seeing in the United States because they are so blatantly biased? They actually push political agendas now. It's not like they're left-leaning like they used to be. Now they're actively pushing political agendas. How big of a threat is that to the United States?
It's huge. And in the book, I have a whole chapter devoted to that topic. The press is the only business protected by our Constitution. And there's a reason for that. They're supposed to disseminate unbiased information to the people so that the country can be run on the will of the people. But when they put their thumb on the scale, it really distorts things. And I don't think they actually realize that the first thing that communist and socialist regimes do is completely control the media. They don't realize that they're sowing the seeds of their own destruction.
That is such a great point. And if they actually took the time to read the Democrat Socialists of America platform, they'd actually see that in there, that the government is the one that will control the media and determine what messages get put out and which ones don't. But I find that people often work against their own interests, that they often will push policies that go against their interests. And I think that we saw it in the last election cycle where people said, okay, maybe we'll support Biden because we can't see him. He's in the basement. He doesn't go out and campaign. He doesn't talk. He's not on Twitter, really. And do you think people now realize that the media focused on all the gossip in the Trump administration? However, Today we have a crisis of policy, not gossip. Right. It's a crisis of policy that's actually affecting our lives dramatically, especially those on the middle to lower socioeconomic scale.
Well, I think people are able to see the two different types of administrations juxtaposed. One that really focuses on the people and their rights, and one that focuses on big government. You can see the difference in the quality of your own existence and how you live from day to day. And so I think it's actually a good thing. They always say it's darkest before the dawn. It's pretty dark now, and it's looking very grim. But people can see that there's a correlation between the policies and the quality in their life. And I think that's going to make a big difference in our future.
And looking at the United States, what do you think? The United States is an exceptional nation. What do you think gives it that exceptionalism?
The fact that we are focused on the people. You know, it was a great experiment, and nobody in Europe thought it would work. Not having a monarch, not having a ruling body, running on the will of the people, they thought that was crazy.
Oh, they laughed at it.
Yeah. And yet just, 50 years later, when Alexis de Tocqueville came here to study America because the Europeans were shocked, they said, how could this fledgling nation, barely 50 years old, be competing with us on every level? And, he looked at our government. He was very impressed by the fact that we had checks and balances and a very even distribution of power. He was very impressed by our economic system that encouraged entrepreneurship and innovation. He was very impressed by our educational system. He could find a mountain man in the middle of the forest, and the guy could read. And the guy could tell him about our Declaration of Independence. But the thing that impressed him the most were our churches. And he was very impressed by the sermons that came out of those pulpits that gave people a moral sense and the courage for a ragtag bunch of militiamen to defeat the most powerful military empire on the earth.
You talk about the strength of faith in people's lives. Unfortunately, over the last couple of decades, we've seen people turn their backs on faith. They've turned their backs on religion, moved away from God. And now it's even worse because the coronavirus lockdowns, churches still haven't recovered with attendance. So more people have actually left the church. But at the same time, the churches have also become very political too, pushing political agendas. How important is faith in to keep the United States just that, united?
Well, you look at what our faith teaches us, what our Judeo-Christian values teach us. They teach us to love your neighbor, not to cancel your neighbor, not to hate your neighbor if they have a different yard sign. Those are the kinds of things that allowed us to thrive as a nation. That's why when we had communities that only had 20, 50, 100 families in remote areas, they were able to thrive because they were able to use their various talents and skills working together as a community. It was, when Mr. Johnson fell out of the apple tree during harvest time and broke his leg, everybody else harvested his crops, no questions asked. It was that kind of attitude that comes from loving your neighbor and caring about other people, and many of the tenets that were put forth by our faith.
Such an important point. It wasn't the government that came and harvested the apples. It was the people within the community. Now it seems that anytime something happens in society, no matter how big, no matter how small, people think that government is the answer. They constantly turn to government to pass a law that's not going to work, or it's actually going to create more problems. We've seen that time and time again. How do we get people? So your organization focused on the children for the K through 5. Are you going to be putting out materials that start to reach children in the older grades, in the more advanced grades?
We have it all planned out. K through 5 first, and then we'll be moving to middle school and then to high school. And we have a program called A More Perfect Union, which teaches adults how our government works and how they can get involved. So all I have to do is go to American Cornerstone .org and look up A More Perfect Union. And there's a lot of material there, make people familiar with our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, our Declaration of Independence, and all of our founding documents. So, it's a multifaceted program to educate America.
And it is so important because I know from experience that when students get to my class, many of them will tell me that it's the first time they ever read the Declaration of Independence. Now, this is college. That means they went through a whole K through 12 system without having to read a Declaration of Independence. Meanwhile, I explain to my students, by the time you get to me, you should have it memorized.
That's true. Including the part that says, if the government's not doing a good job, the people have a right to change it.
Oh, well, we see that with this administration. And I do have to ask, when you look at the Created Equal, what gave you the inspiration to write it? What do you hope that the book accomplishes?
Well, I saw that everything was circling back around to race, and people were using race as a cudgel to beat people into submission, to make white people feel guilty, to make minorities feel like victims. And that was completely inappropriate. And so I really want to set the record straight, on things like police brutality and systemic racism. And there's a whole chapter on the George Floyd situation, which was played incessantly 24/7 to make people think that this was something that was going on all the time, that white police officers were out there killing unarmed Black men, when in fact, as the Washington Post makes very clear, the number of Black men killed by police, unarmed Black men per year, less than 24, when there are more than 50 million police civilian encounters a year. So it's a very small number. It's still too many, but it's a very small number. And people distort it. And with the George Floyd incident, there was another incident that occurred almost identical. Knee on the neck, face on the ground, I'm going to die. And he did die. Almost no attention. Why? Because the victim was white and it didn't fit into the narrative. So who cares? These are all the kinds of things that the book really emphasizes and asks us just to look at the real facts, look at the evidence, and let's decide what kind of society we want to have. Do we want to build our future society on the backs of all of our mistakes or on our tremendous successes?
Absolutely. And the opportunity going forward, because you look at a lot of inner city areas, they're actually worse off today than ever before, where you're seeing crime surge and the leadership has failed. So what can Republicans and conservatives do? They ignored and surrendered these communities to Democrats decades ago. What do they need to do to take it back?
The key thing is courage. We have the majority of people in this country who actually think the right way, but they stand in the corner with their head down and hope no one calls them a nasty name. You can't do that. You cannot be the land of the free if you're not the home of the brave. You got to be willing to stand up for what you believe in. As Ronald Reagan said, our freedoms are never more than one generation away from extinction. And that means we have to be active at all times.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Dr. Carson, I want to thank you for taking the time out to come speak to the P.A.S. Report audience. We're going to have links up to the book and to the American Cornerstone Institute on the website. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Keep up the good work.
What a great conversation. I really appreciate Dr. Carson taking the time out to speak with the P.A.S. Report audience. I have all Dr. Carson's links up at the P.A.S. Report website, PASreport.com, so check them out, especially the American Cornerstone Institute's Little Patriots program. That is important for every single parent out there. And make sure to share this episode with others because Dr. Carson's message is so important. It's how we save the Republic. If you find the content of this podcast informative, please take 30 seconds to leave a 5-star rating and write a review on Apple Podcasts. As for Wednesday, I'm working on a great episode, so make sure to tune in. Until then, I want to thank you for joining me.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.